Hey everyone, thank you guys so much for coming. We had such a joy working on this project, so we're really excited to share some of our preliminary findings with you. The structure for tonight is we're going to give a kind of initial feedback of some of the things we found, some recommendations, but this is a co-created process. So we want to also hear from you as far as how you feel like they might be implemented. Do they fit? Do they make sense? So we're going to have a session that's more interactive towards the end, where there's some kind of stations around the room in the back where you'll get to feed into some of our recommendations so we can build on findings that we've already discovered. So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm Meg Cesaro. I run 21 Artists, and we had a really intensive period of community consultation for this project. So our kind of initial purpose was really to better understand the cultural engagement and needs of ethnic minority communities in Tass Valley. So to really kind of build a legacy for this work. So as Rebecca mentioned, this really does feel like the prime moment for this type of work. And it's up to kind of all of you to really bring that all together and make it happen. So a bit about the kind of methodology that we use. So we had a really flexible and adaptive approach. It was asset-based, which means focusing on the resources and the things that are already present within Tass Valley, within the community here, to really kind of use research to draw out those things from the interviews that we had. So there was 4 phases, which were around desk research, consultations with key stakeholders and community groups. We had some kind of more group consultation sessions and some participatory about observation. So in total, we had 33 interviews with various people around Tass Valley in Hampshire. And that was, such a broad kind of range of different people, which in our final report, you can see a whole list of all those amazing people that we were able to meet. Some of you are in the room right now. And through our analysis process, we use thematic analysis, which is, pulling out key themes from the data to then kind of bring it all together and make some recommendations from that. And then, as Rebecca mentioned, the next steps are really the kind of dissemination. So after today, we'll release our final report in a couple of weeks. And then it's about implementation. So really finding ways to really enact some of these recommendations.
Yeah, and just to say that the paper that you have on your seat is just if you want to make notes, as we speak, if you have any additional idea, we will gather them in the end, because really the idea is that we present and this might trigger something in you that you might want to take a note of, and this would be very helpful as additional data collection. But yeah, so one of the key objectives of the project was also to understand a bit more what is the current situation in terms of the ethnic composition of the area. And thanks to AMTAS, which is a very comprehensive data set, we found out that actually Tass Valley is the 3rd most diverse region in Hampshire. So in particular, it could be even more than that, because traveler groups usually identify many times themselves as white British, and this has been growing over time. So it's more and more diverse, and as we can see, in particular, looking at the languages that are spoken is quite a helpful way to understand the composition. So, and it's mostly Polish and Portuguese, as you can see here, but also Nepali, Chinese, Bengali, and then Romanian and Roma. And the situation, as you mostly know, is very different in Andover or in Romsey. So Andover has been, is way more diverse, but is mostly working class and mostly people who came here to work in industrial areas. And what has been described as really a city that sometimes people don't see as a place to live, but more as a place to sleep. So something where they don't have a very strong sense of belonging, because it's mostly they live here, but just to find a cheaper accommodation compared to London. And this, according to interviewees, is one of the reasons why they don't engage so much with activities in the area, because they don't feel like this is their place yet. It's just a temporary place where they spend their time. And instead, Romsey, by contrast, is more active from a cultural point of view, but is mostly white, middle class. So it's a different type of activities that are going on. And in particular, like what we've heard from interviewees is that they are mostly around like Christianity and is not so welcoming towards like other kind of faith. And the villages are also like mostly like wealthier and not so easy to engage with from a diversity point of view. And so based on like barriers to engagement, focusing on Andover first of all, we found that the history of the city, so what I was saying, the fact that people don't really identify, don't really see their identity reflected in the area is one of the key barriers to engagement. So the fact that like really we heard like it lacks vibrancy or like it has no heart, something that, you know, is quite powerful and reveals really that people still don't identify and don't feel pride towards the area. But also the urban design is something that has been mentioned. So the fact that people, it's not easy to see each other in the city or like to see what the city can offer. So the fact that you have to go through the shopping mall to enter the city, or the fact that you would not enter the alleys if not for the arches that now show what are the restaurants and the shops that you can see. So the really urban design as a barrier to visibility of these communities. And really like the fact that a lot of people said like, it's not because people don't want to engage, it's just that they're not given the opportunity. So the lack of visibility and the lack of opportunities for exchange and for interaction, which is paradoxical because most of the restaurants and the shops are owned and run by people from these minority ethnic communities, but still they are not visible in terms of what they can offer and how they contribute to the city daily life. Then racism, discrimination, and language have been mentioned are key barriers to engagement. So for example, the veterans, like all the elderly from the Nepalese community, they don't speak the language. So of course for them it's difficult to engage, but also people from like working class, they simply don't have time to engage with the kind of artistic and cultural activities. One of the things that we heard the most was that if you need to take care of your basic needs, you will not engage with artistic and cultural practices. So the socioeconomic dimension has been mentioned many times as a barrier, but also the fact that they want to keep themselves invisible, because sometimes it helps not to attract any form of resentment or just not to trigger, you know, like this kind of discrimination. So for example, this leads them not to, for example, ask for housing advice, like mortgage advice, like housing benefits. So all the kind of basic access, like essential services that they would need access to, they simply don't ask for that because they don't want to attract too much attention. And we think that even if it does, this goes beyond art and culture, is very important because art, as we will see, can be a way to help people to talk about these issues as well and engage with these issues. And key thing is that we can't move to the art and culture if these basic needs are not addressed as well. And so in terms of engagement strategies, one of the key things, like they all agree, like many of you are here, but they all agree that festivals and events are a key way to engage. They might seem a one-off, you know, something that is not sustainable, but actually if you look at the Islimela or like in Basingstoke, the event that they organize, it started very small and now people from other areas go and identify and feel, and this really helps to feel a sense of belonging, but it's also an easy way to do that. Because like the suggestion was start from the commonality, and the commonality is first of all food that we all like, that is uncontroversial, that can be, you know, can just showcase a variety of different traditions, different cultures, and making these people feel proud of what they are offering. But also the fact that this can be on a regular basis, and first of all, it has to be co-created with members of these communities. So for example, starting from an advisory committee with different representatives, like from different groups, but also most vulnerable, like most sometimes like less heard, that all need to have a voice in the organization of these events. That need to be facilitated by those who know what are the resources, what are the key steps, what are the logistics that you need to take care of. So for example, the council, the foundation can have a role in facilitating, but then these communities need to be represented in at the organization level. And also, like, what is interesting about the ISLI Melle, for example, is that when you go to the event, you also have the NHS doing referrals. People can do blood tests. People can have a vaccination, can have a mortgage advice. So it's a way to also reconnect to that socioeconomic issues that we were talking about. So the event is just an easy way to, while doing something, talk about something else. That is like through a light way, you also talk about more serious issues. And one of the ideas that we heard was to do an event to celebrate the contribution that these communities give to the place. So for example, starting from the army, so starting from the history of Andover, but then also moving on to the shops, to the restaurants and their contribution to the daily life as train drivers, but also building on COVID and the fact that many of these people are nurses, are doctors, can really give a way to celebrate, even involving the mayor, as has been suggested. So the mayor will choose a representative from like one of these communities, or more of them, to really celebrate and be thankful for, because it's all about building the confidence of these communities to engage. So first of all, for them to know that they are listened to, that they are seen, but then also that authorities recognize that they are contributing. And also importantly, the fact that the British culture cannot be forgotten. So all interviewees also agreed that it's not just about minority ethnic communities, it has to be about both. So host communities need to be represented, and as much as possible, these events, but any initiative, need to engage both groups, especially like to avoid resentment again, but also to favor integration, to favor the dialogue that needs to be nurtured. And then I think something that is important is also as a way to increase the visibility of Andover. So, like, because an event like that, as we did in ISLI or in Basingstoke, it just made the city more popular and it just attracts people. I used to work in favelas in Brazil, and one of the things was like, how do you change the reputation of a place that is known to be very violent, or like no one wants to go there? Because you create something that is unique about that place and you change the narrative. And actually here is something very similar. You need to change the narrative and you need to make the place visible for something else. And ISLI Melle became like such an excuse. And then also like something that I thought about with Andover Bit that gave really good suggestions was that it doesn't have to be, you know, a conventional event necessarily, so just a big party or like an event with stalls. It can be a tour to the city. So there is like the museum, for example, Andover Museum organizes these tours around Andover. So this could be like really immersive tours where you like groups of people go to different restaurants or like shops where the waiters like dress with like cultural clothes, or like there is the possibility to taste different food. And there is the Tale project, the like project about tales, storytelling, that is also funded by the foundation, that can also, so using theater within these venues to tell something about those cultures. And so really all fusion events were, for example, organized around like competitions, around like similar dishes that different communities cook in different ways, or something around a typically British dish that another community can add something to, like what Nepalese spice you would add to a British meal. So something really around activities that can bring these communities together, and maybe creating even a documentary about the process. So creating a documentary about like all the process of organizing this activity, of dialogue, of engaging these different communities together, and what was the final result. Because this can also tell a lot about how these communities can actually work together, what they've contributed to, and this can be interweaved with like interviews and stories about how these communities, like how these people came here, what is their favorite places in Andover. Because it's really humanized their relationship with the place.
Sara mentioned briefly, but one other kind of key recommendation is around designing an advisory group. And some people in this room have mentioned this as something they'd like to see happen. But having a group that maybe would sit alongside a dedicated inclusion or engagement officer within the council, who really works towards this on a daily basis in their role. But having an advisory group that's built of not just of ethnic minority communities, but people who have disabilities, young people, LGBTQ plus people. So there's kind of more representation, but that they don't just sit alone, but they also are integrated within the kind of fabric of how the decisions are made in other structures. So that kind of creates this fusion of people together rather than this kind of otherness of those groups. One other key thing that we'll kind of flush out with some of the examples that we have towards the end, but using arts and creativity to address and engage with other kind of social and human needs. So, focusing on really getting to the bottom of what are the health and the social and the economic issues that are a priority for target communities, and then finding ways to use creative approaches, which will give you some examples of towards the end, to help to address some of those needs. And so it's seeing creativity as a process rather than a final product. You might have a great, really nice final product that's creative and artistic at the end, but it's really seeing art and creativity as a mechanism for social change.
And here is an example. Two representatives of the project are here. And I think it's a great example of art as a process rather than as a product, because this is a project that combines research and art. So it's through digital art. The project enabled young people from Syrian refugee, but also host community to look at the place in a different way. So one of the activities, for example, was to bring objects that were familiar to them to unfamiliar places. So like to different parts of the city, and then take pictures, to like film or create animations about these, because this was a way to, for example, like get to talk about feelings of isolation or feelings of belonging, feelings of like community based on objects that meant something to them, but as like got a different meaning once they were put in a different place. And also a way to not to to talk about the person, because the object was still something quite intimate, but without necessarily representing the person. That is something that can be quite uncomfortable, especially for refugees. And then so digital skills are a way using digital art for these people to learn digital skills, but also to because they are accessible, is something that can be easily learned based on like mobile phones, but the product can be quite sophisticated. And the idea was then to create like an exhibition where all these outputs would have been presented in order to raise awareness about the meanings behind these outputs, but also the entire process. And really to, again, the sense of pride and proud and make these people proud about what they managed to do, or developing confidence about what they did and the entire process.
Another key recommendation is around taking over underused or empty public spaces. So really using the kind of resources that are already present within Test Valley and really kind of taking advantage of those through kind of embedding art into those spaces. So empty storefront spaces, spaces we were just walking through the Chantry Center earlier today, and there's some empty spaces within that. So kind of taking over the shopping center with artists and arts, bringing art into public spaces, having dance in the square, things like that, where you really kind of, it doesn't require a lot of funding or things that you'll have to bring in. It's actually really highlighting the things that are already here within the spaces and reanimating some of the kind of the spaces that have been abandoned or that aren't being used at the moment. So, also having exhibitions in kind of non-traditional spaces. So in barbershops, in restaurants, in spaces where you normally wouldn't see an exhibition, you wouldn't see art happen. It's using that as a way to kind of bring people into these kind of more vibrant spaces. And having some immersive theater, storytelling, slam poetry, really kind of having these dynamic excuses for people to come together on a more regular basis using these kind of low cost tools. And then I think importantly for the kind of visibility aspect is to get press. Try and get press and some kind of outside attention towards this, so you can then also not only celebrate the people within Test Valley, but potentially bring people from outside to kind of build more character into some areas of Test Valley, particularly Andover, around a lot of this.
And this example again, like this speaks to many different elements that we've mentioned so far. So first of all, the fact that using art as a process to talk about something that has a different relevance, so in this case, like climate change, but also the importance, like not to start with an agenda. So one of the key recommendations was that you can't like reach out, for example, to these communities knowing what they will want to talk about, or like assuming that they will need art for a certain reason. Like it's really like try and listen what is important for them, like what are the kind of issues that they care about and they would like to talk about, and then use art either to animate these discussions or to raise awareness about the issues that are important for them. So in these cases, this project was based on surveys done with children and young people about what was their key concern, like what was the issue that mattered to them like the most, and it was climate change. And on this basis, they organized an art project where these kids were invited to create art like installations like that are like circular, because it was the idea was to represent the concept of unity, because climate change is something that affects everybody, no matter like the community, like the group they belong to. And then like create art installations with QR codes like that was like that you could scan and hear the voices of the young people and the children that created that installation that explained like what were their key concerns and key views around climate change. And these were then spread like all over like Winchester Cathedral, but also like indoor and outdoor spaces as a way to, of course, like raise awareness about the topic, but also sort of create bonds, so cohesion between those who stopped in front of that installation and question themselves about the issue that these artistic creations wanted to raise discussions about.
Okay. Yeah, so and then another key recommendation is around tapping into existing funding sources. So also finding ways to kind of use the funding that's available to empower local people to design their own solutions. So as an example, start with a kind of small test trial. You have £2,000 for 5 different projects, and people in the area can kind of test different things that they want to organize. So having their own festival, do their own workshops, things like that would obviously be open to the public. But utilizing that funding in a different way so that it brings those resources into local people having more of a leadership role around how those resources are allocated. And I think really one of the things that I've learned in my work over the years is that the importance of kind of iterative testing. So you give a small amount of money in the beginning, you test a concept over time, you get feedback, you iterate that process, and then I've seen some things that have started out for £400 and now are huge. But it's also a really great way to act on something rather than spending too much time planning, really just putting things into motion.
Yeah, and I think what Megan just said, like, is really like something that we would like to like reaffirm, that has to do with long-term engagement. So the fact that you need to empower these communities to do what they want to do. So go there without an agenda, possibly having like really community cohesion, like officers from these communities who speak the language, who can go there and make them understand that something will happen after these consultations, and their needs will be listened to, not assumed, and turned into something that can be small, starting like Eastleigh Mella started very small. I think it started with like £500, but then it grew. But the most important thing is really proving that they have been heard, and something followed up from that. And so for this reason, again, the advisory group that can be applied to existing funding to begin with, to existing initiatives. but then like really creating a sustained long-term engagement with people who come from that community in a leading position. And also like something else like that came from someone who lives in Romsey actually, that there should be like regular meetings, so networks established, because for example, there are business networks in Romsey, but they are like from white, and she was telling, like the interviewee was telling me that she doesn't feel like she has the authority or like the position just to raise any issue, for example, suggesting to do an event about something that is not linked to Christianity. This comes more, like it's more difficult that this comes from her, because she's a minority by definition. So she would, and she's too concerned about getting accepted, not to trigger like any negative feelings that she's worried about. So this would have to come, like she needs to build support behind her. So for example, creating a network that meets on a regular basis would build like familiarity and confidence in her and in others to raise these kind of issues. But as long as like she's alone and she doesn't even know if there are others from the same background living in Romsey, this will never happen. She will not feel confident enough. So really creating the opportunity for these people to meet on a regular basis. And also the fact of, so the urban design, as I was mentioned, is something that is of course long-term, but creating public spaces, increasing the opportunities for these people to engage in the city, and also like building on the climate unity project, like maybe do something in how really the aesthetic of the city. So there are really nice things carved on the floor. So one of the suggestions was, why not to carve something about the contribution of these communities, like in the wall, in the walking path. So really making it visible as much as possible, something that people bump into. And then offering, like in terms of like refugees, for example, offering volunteering opportunities. So there are projects like the Ugly Ducklings, for example, that offer these kind of opportunities, which are a way for refugees to learn the language, to learn new skills, to build confidence. And this is something relatively easy to do that make them feel useful and part of something while learning, while contributing. And finally, like building on the opportunities offered by the local radio stations, for example, to give some of these communities, like, or all of them, like a space, dedicated space for their music, for interviews, for any kind of talks related to issues that matter to them. And then this can then talk to the rest of the community as well. So not just dedicated to them, but something, just giving them a space for them to express. This is just a list of potential partners that we think is important to just have there, because they all have like complementary skills. They do very important work that we think like, and they can contribute just to each other work. So there is of course the council, because of the great networks and the links and the resources. And then as I was saying, like facilitating the thinking process around the logistics for events, like what needs to be thought about, but also civil society organizations like Unity, Two Saints that work with refugees in particular, Ugly Ducklings, as I was saying, like offering volunteering opportunities in like rebuilding, like renovating furniture, but can be like applied to many different things, as well as the local associations. So from the Nepalese, the Asian Welfare Association, the Romsey Silk, and Overbit, because all those events about like the tours of the city, reanimating the restaurants and the shops, so like there are really like synergies to be exploited. Museums and library, as I was saying, the Indover Museum organize a number of tours of the city, which can be then connected, or also the exhibition for the common ground is something that they could help with. Churches, because another thing that we heard is that like we really, of course, is a very important entry point to a number of these communities. So both the Indians and the African and the Chinese, like they all congregate around like religious events. And I think that not like the churches cannot be forgotten, because it's such an important part of the life of these communities, as well as schools and local scout club when like as far as like young people and children are concerned. especially Scout, for example, they are already open to the international dimension, to diversity. And so people who are part of Scout Club, both children and parents, will be more open to this kind of like activity. So it start easy, start from organizations that are already open to this kind of initiatives, as well as police community cohesion officers, which have been like great supporters also of this project and will be more than happy to keep helping. Okay, so here quickly.
Yeah. So we're going to give you some examples just to kind of spark your imagination for the next activity, but also just to give you, because I think some of these are sort of conceptual ideas, but to kind of give you some really concrete ways that we've seen based on our own past experience we've been involved with, that these things have actually worked and been really powerful tools for change.
Right. So this, for example, is a festival that was created in Brazil and then replicated in South Africa and in London as well. And it's the Festival Home Theater. It all started in favela again. And the idea was that to bring theater, because another thing is like bring art to them rather than expecting people to go. And so in this case, is a festival organized in people's houses. So or in abandoned building in very resource deprived areas like favelas, for example. And the idea was to overcome the barrier to like accessibility, mobility, the fact that many times these people have not easy access to recreational opportunities. So why not to bring the theater there to their houses, but also focused on daily issues? Because another thing is that not to expect that people will approach art easily if it talks about something that is not related to them and to their daily issues. And so this was really focused on the stories of people, first to make it easier to approach, but also to make them, again, like visible, like to make them feel worth being represented in a theater pieces. At the same time, like a few of these pieces were, like one was focused on dyslexia, for example, raising awareness about the public that was attending, about what dyslexia was. And this was suggested by one of the interviewees as a way, for example, to talk about sexual abuse, like domestic abuse, harassment, that was mentioned, like these were mentioned as present but very underreported issues in the area. And this could be a way to just raise awareness subtly and raise a discussion like afterwards. And this again, just about documentary. This was a project created by young people in Brazil through a project that Meg will talk about. And again, the idea was to change the narrative about the place, a place that they were very ashamed of. So no one wanted to say, like one of these girls, like she always told the bus driver that she needed to drop off a stop earlier because she was so ashamed of being from there. But then the documentary was all about like interviewing the 3 oldest residents of the favela and 3 young musicians who then created the music about the entire process. And the idea was really like to focus on like, why do you love this place? What is your favorite place? What stories do you associate to this place? And then the documentary was exhibited like in the public square with people really feeling proud of the place where they come from, but also like of being represented there. Because it's not that easy that like to have a documentary focus on a favela that is not just focused on violence. And in this case, people really wanted just the stories. As well as, of course, like learning skills as with the Common Ground project.
Right, and I'm going to give you now some examples from the UK. So I was one of the lead producers for a project called Agents of Creative Change, which is run by Battersea Arts Centre, which paired artists with public and third sector professionals within the context where they work. So social services, police, people that work in prison. So, you know, people that don't work in a traditional art setting were paired with artists to devise creative solutions for social issues that were presented by the kind of public and third sector professionals who took part. And so the kind of methodology behind it was to devise a way of co-creating change. So using creativity as a mechanism, as a process for a wider change system to happen. It was interdisciplinary, so bringing people from all different disciplines together in one space, sharing ideas, sharing solutions. And so this is the model that I developed as part of it, seeing the artists on one side, seeing the public and third sector. So really, rather than having a project that was based more in the art world, or was based more in the public and third sector world, devising a new project where it was a meeting in the middle of creativity, of a creative approach within a social change context. So probably the most successful project that came out of this was a project called the Lemonade Response Unit. So this is devised by a local police officer in Battersea in South London and an artist named Victoria Melody. And so the kind of key issue they were trying to address was to try and shift negative perceptions towards police within that area. So Victoria and Addie came up with this idea to kind of find a creative way for people to engage on a more human level with a police officer, rather than seeing it so much as an other. Because he was saying to us that he would only see people normally when they were in crisis mode. So how do you have a kind of everyday normal conversation with a police officer? So Victoria designed and made this lemonade cart, which was intentionally very kind of, you can't see the colors, but it's bright yellow. She would wear bright yellow. And she would go out into the community and she would really invite people to kind of come and ask a police officer any question you want in exchange for a free glass of lemonade. So we started it off, it worked really well because it was a very hot day and people really wanted lemonade. So it was a really good incentive for people to come and ask questions. So, people would ask really kind of basic questions. Do you carry a gun? Like, do you have a girlfriend, whatever it might be, but then they also use it as a mechanism to ask some really important questions about restraining orders, about serious issues that they didn't know the answer to how they might actually engage with the police officer about those things. So it was a really successful project. It got picked up by the press. And it's just a really kind of simple way to show that creativity can be used as a kind of wider process for social transformation within these areas. So that's very happy police officer and artists behind. So they engaged now about 2,000, probably 3,000 people now, because I don't work there anymore, and she's still running the project. So she's actually taken the project outside of London as well, and she's trialing it and testing it in other regions of the UK. And this started with £400. So they were given a very small seed amount of money. After they went through the kind of facilitated Agents of Creative Change process, they were given a small amount of money to actually test it, and then it's turned into a much bigger thing from there. So the kind of methodology also that was utilized within that is a methodology called Scratch, which is very similar to prototyping or design thinking. So it's starting with an idea, planning that idea, testing the idea, getting feedback, analyzing that feedback, giving it some time, and then feeding that all back into the idea as it develops. So rather than spending too much time planning and then you say, oh, I have this final thing that I'm going to test, you plan it to a point where you're ready to share it, and then you implement it. So it's really action oriented rather than spending too much time talking and thinking and planning. How can you test something and get feedback and work it back into this as it develops? So this is developed by Battersea Art Center, and it's used in all different industries, but they just call it Scratch because they use it in theater in that way. So another project or program that I was involved with there was one called Create Course, also a really successful program. It's not very expensive to run. So Create Course was offering weekly kind of art courses and classes that were a whole day long. It was free. There was free lunch, free childcare for anybody who wanted to come. And it was focusing on really accessible everyday creativity. So it was a way for local community members to come together during the day. A lot of them were moms who maybe were staying at home, people who were retired, maybe people who were off sick from work because they had some other issues. So it was a way for them to kind of just use creativity as a way to connect, but also it was made very accessible. So anybody could come and think about how they could be creative in gardening or in, making music with their kids or in decorating or cooking or things like that. So it was applying creativity in a really everyday context. That was just a really transformative project for a lot of people. Yeah. And then the last one is one called The Agency. So this was the documentary that Sara talked about was part of the agency that ran in Brazil. So this is actually a Brazilian methodology that has been transplanted now in the UK. So it's a creative entrepreneurship program for 15 to 25-year-olds that focuses on more deprived areas of the UK. So at the moment it's running in London, Manchester, and Southampton, not far from here. And also ran in Cardiff and Belfast, and there's lots of other places around the UK that might be implementing it. So it's using this asset-based approach to community development. So young people identify the things that they want to address, the needs that they see in their own communities, and they use some of the resources that are already present to address those needs, and uses a creative process, a lot of theater activities and more creative activities to kind of engage young people to be at the forefront of social change within their communities. So, you know, it's really a process of co-creation as well, rather than people coming in from the outside saying, these are the changes that we want to see within the place where you live. Young people are really at the forefront of co-creating that change. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to give you the examples, but you can talk to me about it after, and I can tell you. I'll talk about one actually. So universal language, just to kind of give you an example of what this means in context. So universal language, I speak football, was designed by a young man named Abdi. And he came to the UK originally as a refugee from Somalia and really wanted to play football, but they didn't let him play because he didn't speak English. And so it was quite a negative experience that he had, but he used that through the process of the agency to design his own football club that was also an English language school, so that young people like him didn't have the same experience if they came to the UK and they didn't know how to speak English. They could create a community around that. And now this project is, you know, it started off very small, and now it's kind of being sponsored by Chelsea Football Club and all of that. So using that kind of iterative development over time. That's the end. Thank you guys for listening. That went on a little bit longer than planned. Yeah, we would love to hear any questions, or we can have questions at the end if you prefer to kind of jump into the activity. Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, any questions? You mentioned on Paris of language, of course, when we're talking about theatre.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of the theatre company. There's a South African theatre company. The actors devise the work, and they all speak in their first language, which there are a dozen of them in South Africa. Which is a way of overcoming the problem of if you fit with people whose English isn't, or may not have confidence in their English, which isn't the same it's not good. Only way of overcoming it. It's not really quite a style.
Very interesting. Especially because like one of the things that we thought about was that like the foundation is running like the Tales, the project called Tales is a great way to try and do that, because these are tales about Westphali that could even be, you know, part of the storytelling could be done by these other communities, each speaking, for example, their language, but telling about like stories about this place. That would be very, very nice, because we are thinking either the protagonists of the tales could be from these communities, or the storytelling could be about stories about them. And I think that this is a good way to also implement that. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting presentation. That's a good piece of work, I'm sure. I just want to point to one thing, which is in the MTAS side, if I may, that I think they were conflating ethnic identity, nationality, and language a little bit. Maybe just look at that side again, because they're talking about Bengali as a language alongside ethnic identity, and actually maybe Bangladesh has been mentioned, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, Bengali is either a language or an ethnic identity from India. So I mean, I think MTAS probably threw that together quite quickly, and maybe, you know.
Okay.
But anyway, that's just. I'm sure you've thought about when you mentioned festivals and events as being kind of a powerful thing. also, and having seen that, I was really reassured when the longer term engagement slide came up, because there is a danger, isn't there, around festivals, and oh, you're Chinese, therefore you'll be dancing under, you know, I mean, the humanising process is often about not being exotic rather than being exotic, if I put it that way. So I dare say you're taking that into account, and you will be taking this into account in the project. But my question really was about when you put where you were talking about barriers to participation and so on, whether gender or sex really, you know, women's perspectives in particular, as to, you know, are kind of in the mix, if you like. I mean, I don't know. It's all a very big question, I grant you, but really it seems quite important within particular groups what women feel able to do and not able to do, and why.
Yeah. So no, that's a very good point. So on the event side, I think it's very important to stress your point, because it can be like an event in itself will not be enough, and what we heard is like it will take generations to actually change that, especially like but we heard that this is a good way to kickstart things, in particular here in Andover, where there is already a more diverse basis. This cannot begin in Romsey, for example, but Romsey can start seeing what is happening in Andover and little by little change. But I totally agree about like the long-term engagement is something that has to be taken into account.
Yeah, and we would kind of favor that side, but it came up so much in our interviews was around festivals and events that, you know, we had to really include it, and we see that as a starting point, so it's not the same.
Yeah. And on the gender side, we heard about that, especially with relation to the refugees. So many times, like for example, domestic abuse is a thing that is preventing, like that it doesn't get, is not very discussed because it's taboo. But one of the suggestions for the Festival on Theatre was to do theatre pieces with women only, for example, to raise awareness about this issue and maybe trigger discussion afterward, because I've been involved in this kind of activities, and I could see how the intimate atmosphere and like the size of the event then actually invite this kind of conversations. We didn't really hear about women not participating in cultural activities in general, but more about social issues that matter to them in particular and that art can help to address.
From the people that you talked to through this process, and you talking about bringing together a group of people afterwards to kind of keep it going, have you got the feel from the different communities members that would like to take part in that? If that's something you've been asked about through the process or not yet?
So they suggested that. Not all of them like mentioned that, but they suggested like to create something like that. And for example, the Nepalese would like to have like just a bigger venue to welcome other communities to the event that they already organized. So this openness is there for sure.
Yeah, no, I think definitely there's an interest in that. Might take a bit of time, but
Yeah.
Because, for example, one of the examples we were provided is that there was this Indian couple like looking for a house, and they were suggested Romsey, and say never, because we don't know anybody there. Like there is no one from, and instead there is, because then the interviewee was from the same background. So it's just, you know, many times they maybe didn't suggest because they don't know there is the opportunity to do something like that. But really it's a lot about visibility and creating this opportunity.
But Andover in general has that. If that's not just particularly for Black and ethnic minorities, I wouldn't say that, because coming from London to here, I would say that things are just not signposted well as much in town.
Exactly.
Rather than groups don't feel welcome, I would say that people just don't find out about things.
Yeah.
That in fact, if they did, because the minute there's a festival of some sort here, when they have the town parade and stuff like that, everybody's there.
Yeah.
And I think when they're advertising things like the schools and stuff like that, my children go to a Catholic school, and I would say in the last few years, the changes from when we moved here 5 years ago to now, the majority of children in the class are mixed. So there's as many English, Polish and African in the classes now. And I know you're saying that basis with Christianity, but Catholic and Christianity within the community is massive, even with the Black and ethnic minorities. So I do think that the Christian festivals also draws them in. I
Yeah.
think maybe signposting and people understanding that they can get things. So I know what you said about getting things outside of town, but I would say that if you concentrate on things being in the town,
Yeah.
then at least they would know where they always need to go.
Yeah.
Because the more diverse it becomes outside of the town, then they've got to find more places, at least if you're coming in the town. And also then the town's getting more of a footfall, which it already needs anyway,
Yeah.
all those shops.
And one of the simple things that, you know, one of the people we interviewed was saying, just even having the really lovely like signs, like actual signs
Yeah.
that are on the kind of alleyways around here was a really powerful tool for attracting more
Obviously,
business.
some
People know
think
where
the
to
same
go.
about seeing London and stuff like that, but I just wonder how that feeds into Andover with regards to the different ethnicities that are here, because I would say it's completely different. It sounds, there's not really anywhere I could ever, even when I've asked council members, people coming in from the Hemingway, I've asked them if they could give me another town where they've done all these projects, and nobody ever does give me something that's the same as Andover. It's very individual.
Yeah, which is why I think this process needs to be co-created with all of you, because, you know, we can give examples and you guys are the experts in Andover and the town. So really thinking of how we can bring all these pieces and use these as seeds for other, you know, adaptations.
Yeah, but I think that, like, you raise a very, like, important point, that it's why, like, we kept mentioning, like, urban design, because the first time that we came here, the thing was, like, it's very difficult to see what's here, like, and I think that those alleyways are the first thing, and that's why we talked about tours, because it's really like getting people to walk around the city and see what's there as part of the activity, rather than just animating one place in a static way. It's getting to people to move around and get more familiar. And again, like about the Common Ground project, it's just finding ways to make people see the city and sort of take over it. That is very important within the city, not outside.
You also mentioned communities that are quite happy to remain quiet.
Yeah.
They weren't wanting to get engaged because they want to get any adverse discrimination.
Yeah.
And they're happy to work and basically have a sort of slightly distant relationship with other communities. And that's something I'm not fully appreciated. This is probably quite now. Lots and lots of quite interesting observation.
Yeah, it was more like what we heard was that it was more about them not wanting to bother. So to ask for like benefits, for example, or this kind of information. The person who, like, it was just one person who said that, and but I think it was quite a knowledgeable one from like at least what we got. But this might not be completely true, you know, might be here. But there was a project following up from that because of how we noticed that these people were not accessing basic services because they didn't feel comfortable in making themselves visible, asking for this kind of advice. But it wasn't about them not wanting to engage with other communities. It was more, we don't want to bother, we prefer not to ask for our like mortgage advice or like housing benefits, because otherwise we will attract something negative. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions from the chat. One person says, do we know how many minority communities there are in Test Valley region? And is there a community leader for each? And then a suggestion, could we organise an international food day? This would bring together mixed communities and families.
For the first question,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have a good amount of information, but there's not really a leader for each group, I wouldn't say at this stage. I feel like that might take time to really kind of people to feel empowered to take on that leadership role. Initially, it's about just kind of first engaging in more meetings, in events, things like that, and then hopefully those people will emerge. International Food Day, yeah,
Yeah.
That sounds great.
And there's another idea or seed of an idea. Somebody's looking at your website and notices you did an arts project called Dog Ballet. And there's a large dog walking community in Andover. Could you tell us a little bit about Dog Ballet? Do you know what they're talking about? Well, dog walking then, let's take that as another avenue. Anyway,
But on
don't
the
worry.
website, there was 21 artists.
I guess so, but maybe they're looking at the wrong
I
website.
think that's a different.
Okay, possibly the wrong website.
Yeah, and about
Yeah.
There's an idea though.
so about the data also, like exactly like MTAS is quite comprehensive, but also like the police is currently doing a mapping. So the police community cohesion officer that we listed as potential partners, they are doing a mapping. So they are trying to map as much as possible the communities that are here.
Mm.
So that is definitely part of the activities that are being carried out.
Well, thank you very much for the, what you mentioned, sometimes churches. So what about multi-faith?
Yeah.
spaces? So the thing by mentioning is, multi-faith spaces would give more influence to other communities to be engaged in those churches.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Yeah, that was like an oversight, I think. Thing that we definitely interviewed people from different, religious affiliations, so mosques and other religious.
Nothing town specifically Christian based, though, is it? When they have like, markets and stuff like that, and then nothing is specifically based Christian, is it? It's like I know we said how big is that around festivals and it's fine. It's not specifically because I think there's quite a lot of different people there. Over the years, it's changed a lot.
Here, definitely,
Yeah.
yeah. I was in Ramsey, there was a bit less.
Yeah,
There is the
okay.
Abbey that apparently is quite,
Yeah.
dominating and everything
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
But no, not here, not here.
yeah.
Here it's just like they probably like, they really mentioned
So
like.
was the interview
church.
across Romsey as well as one? Was the interview across Andover and Romsey as one?
Yeah, no, like just test value.
Test
So
value in
so
general.
we covered both. Also because it was interesting to see the different identity of the two places. How like this can be like so diverse here,
Yeah.
not diverse there, but also like in terms of socioeconomic. And that's why we got like the interviewees from Romsey said like it can't start from there. It should start from maybe here and then trickle down or like because it's easier, just like where the situation is a bit more prepared.
These are barriers to that trickle down level for public transport links between the towns, because it's like 10, 12 miles, but unless you've got a car, you're not going to be doing one thing in one town. Moving backwards and forwards.
Yeah, yes. At the same time, we saw quite a lot of enthusiasm toward the Eastleigh Manla, so people go there from Romsey. So they go to Eastleigh. So like if Andover managed to get like, to the level, to the point that that is an event that people want to attend. But I think that the limited mobility is definitely a barrier that has been mentioned. And that again is the reason why the home theater is a potential solution. So starting from places is also like another thing was like make people see the places in a different way. So the day-to-day places in a different way. So that's why like the shops are taking over like the shopping center and start small from places that people see on a daily basis, but like interpreted in a different way. Both here and there. I think that's actually.
Yeah, and transport even within Andover came up in some of our interviews as if you don't have a car, it's quite difficult to get around, so.
We've got the room till 8.
Yeah.
Should we go to longer? So do you want to get off doing your
Yes,
bits on
yeah.
next?